everyone! In this week's video, I'm redrawing pages from my first sketchbook. Recently, I was digging in my old art bin, and as I came across the first ever sketchbook that I had completed. I do want to clarify, I did have sketchbooks before this one, but when I was younger, I didn't really know how to properly fill a sketchbook. I would draw stuff, and then if I liked it, I would rip it out and put it into a folder. It wasn't until I started watching sketchbook tour videos on YouTube that I understood how most people filled their sketchbooks. Hence why this is the first sketchbook I actually finished, even though I'd been drawing for a lot of years at this point. Anyways, I thought it sounded like fun to try to redraw pages from this sketchbook in my current sketchbook. One thing I am a bit worried about is that my current sketchbook is much smaller. It is a decent size, it's just that my first sketchbook is massive, measuring at 9 by 12 inches. It may be a little tricky to draw some of the pages at a smaller size, but I'll try my best. So I flipped through the sketchbook, and the first page I wanted to try redrawing is this one that has fan art of Link from The Legend of Zelda on it. I feel like this drawing doesn't do him justice, so I want to try to redraw it. So I feel like I never really talk about when I'm placing down the guidelines for my drawing, so how about we start with talking about that this time around. When drawing ahead, I pretty much always start with a circular shape. Sometimes the shape is more of an oval depending on the position, but is most often closer to a circle. I keep my sketch loose and light since I do intend to erase this later. Next, I draw a line down the circle to show me where I want the middle of the face to be. Since Link is slightly turned to our left, I make the center line be off-center of the circle. Lastly, for guidelines, I draw a line under the circle. This line is often for helping me know how the head is tilted, and also helps me get an idea of where I want to place the cheek of the face and other features. I'll sometimes draw in a second line that I use to line up the eyes, but I don't do that as often as I used to. So yeah, that's how I set up my guidelines. I liked the idea of starting with redrawing this page because it is fairly simple. It's basically just a headshot drawing. I was a bit nervous to draw the hood, but we will get to that in a bit. Like with the original drawing, I am sketching it out first with erasable color pencil. Originally, I used a bright tealish color, but decided to switch to a deeper blue for this sketch, mostly because it is easier to see on camera. My camera always has a hard time picking up the brighter teals and blues, and I want you to actually be able to see my sketch. One thing about me being obsessed with a single character for multiple years, if you don't know, I really like Link, is I have a lot of different drawings of them, and they are a lot of fun to compare since they are the same character over a long period of time. I find it especially funny how much changes there are in Link's face over the years. I feel like the expression in the first drawing was really tame, but he was supposed to look more angry, so I tried to push that a bit more with this sketch. You may notice throughout this sketch footage that I do erase some parts and redraw them. This is why I sketch out my sketch first very lightly. It makes it much easier to erase things that I want to change. And when I'm in the process of figuring stuff out, it's really nice to be able to erase, so I make sure to draw with a lighter hand than a heavy hand. I was trying to be especially careful since the paper in the sketchbook is thinner. I wasn't sure how much erasing it could handle, but I learned later with a different picture it can handle a good amount of erasing. And we'll talk about that when I get to it. One part I was nervous for is drawing the hood. Honestly, the hood in the first picture is kind of awful, and I made it way too big. I didn't want the hood to affect how I drew the hair or where I make it start, so I sketched out the bangs and front side pieces completely. I felt like if I had started with the hood first, I would have tried to squeeze the hair in and it would have felt really off. Oh, I also sketched in the neck and shoulders so I know what's going on underneath the hood. Once I got everything under the hood in place, I started to sketch out the hood itself. I make sure this time around to keep the opening of the hood smaller, and I also moved the top of the hood down a good amount so it covers more of the top of the head. I do apologize, I go a bit out of frame sometimes. When recording traditional art, I don't always remember to reposition my sketchbook into the view of the camera. Sorry about that. I get too much into the zone or I start focusing on the picture too much and forget about the camera. Which is always kind of a good thing because sometimes I'm too self-conscious about the camera and I keep worrying about it and it's hard to get into a flow. But it's also annoying when I get too much into a flow because then I forget about the camera. Also, in the first sketch, Link wasn't really wearing a specific outfit with the hood, but this time I drew him with a turtleneck to suggest that he's wearing the Hylian tunic. I also sketched in some of the details on the hood that we see in the game. I didn't sketch all of them, just the general bigger details that we see to make things a bit more interesting. I wasn't trying to be totally accurate because I was lazy. Now that my sketch is done, I will outline it with a fine liner. Originally, I used black, but you see, for some reason, I seem to have misplaced all of my black fine liners. So I found some dark ones that could maybe work instead. I swatched them on the other page, and I liked this one the most. I'm kind of glad I couldn't find a black liner because in my more recent sketchbook pages, I don't use black for line art super often. I find it to be a bit too harsh and unforgiving, so I'll use a lighter color instead. Sometimes I'll even use a variety of values for outlining to give my piece more depth, and it lets me make the parts that I want to stick out even darker so they pop. In this case, I only used one since I only used one for the first picture. I wanted to use the same amount of art supplies. Throughout this footage, you'll see me turning my sketchbook. I do this so it's easier for me to draw certain lines or to make it so that the lines I'm drawing match the pivot of my wrist. If I try to draw lines that are uncomfortable with the flow that I draw in, my lines will be more shaky or awkward a lot of times, so I try to move my sketchbook into comfortable positions. Also, you may notice my head peeking into the left side of the video footage, sorry about that, but when doing line work I tend to get very close to the paper to help me be more precise. This can be tricky to do when I'm recording because my camera is basically right in front of my face. This is why my head is down and to the left. I'm trying to move around my camera. It's one of the things I always kind of dislike about recording art traditionally and why I don't do it super often. It can be very awkward at times because I need to have a camera in a good position for all of you to be able to see. But that position is kind of where I need to be. But I try my best to make it work. For the inside part of the hood, I filled it in with kind of sketchy lines. I could have switched to the brush side of my pen, but I wanted to keep the sketchier pen look. Also, I'm not going to show you all the line work. I thought it'd be better to show you slightly slower portions of it instead of making you watch the whole process in super speed. But after I finished the line work, I went in with my colored pencil again to add some shading. This is also why I switched to the deeper blue. In the original drawing, the brighter teal didn't feel like a very nice shadow color. It was just too bright. But this more muted blue worked very nicely for shadows, I feel like. Now that my drawing is done, let's compare the two. Here's the first drawing. Here's the second drawing. And here they are side by side. You can really see the size difference in the sketchbooks. I feel like this new one looks a lot more like Link, and I'm much happier with the hood this time around. It looks more like how hoods actually look. Also, I kind of just noticed that in the first one, he's looking to the right, and in this new one, I made him look at us. I didn't notice that till now, my bad. But yeah, overall, I'm really happy how this new one turned out. For the second drawing, I thought it'd be fun to redraw this sketch that I did with ballpoint pen. I don't sketch with ballpoint pens very often anymore, and it seemed fun to revisit using them. However, I quickly learned that we have like no ballpoint pens in my house. I had to search all over the place. I was searching through all my art supplies, random drawers. I eventually found one pen. I was hoping it worked because it was kind of my only option. And it did work, kind of. I do want to clarify that we did have pens in the house, it's just a lot of them were really funky colors, or they weren't a ballpoint pen. Ballpoint pens have a little ball that get covered in ink when you use them. The reason I wanted to use a ballpoint pen is because they are easier to get variety with. If you draw more lightly, you can get a lighter line, so you can kind of do a light sketch and darken it if you apply more pressure. This pen, however, was kind of old and didn't work very well. For it to work, I had to apply a decent amount of pressure. If I didn't apply enough pressure, it just wouldn't draw. This made it so I couldn't really sketch with lighter line work like I did with my first drawing. Also, this pen's ink is black instead of the purpley blue like the first drawing. But this pen is all I had, so I tried to make it work anyways. I did kind of subconsciously make the face a little different than how I usually do to kind of match the original picture a bit more. Especially in the eyes, it's kind of a mix of how I draw eyes now and how I drew the eyes in the picture. Another thing I do when working with pen is if I'm nervous to draw a line, or if I'm nervous I'll make the line not be in the right spot or size, I'll put where I think I want the line to start and where I think I want the line to end, and then I'll connect them. It gives me a little bit more to go off of instead of just going straight into drawing the line. For shading with pen, I often use hatching. Like in the eyes, to make them look shaded, I draw lines that are closer together at the top. And as I move down, the lines get further and further apart to give the appearance of the color getting lighter, even though it's not really. Working with pen is always an interesting challenge because it is very permanent. Once you draw a line, it stays and there's not much you can do to get rid of it. Using pen always requires me to change my mindset a bit. I do a lot of visualizing before I put my pen to the paper. Compared to when I use pencil, I'll kind of just let myself draw and figure things out as I go and move things if I need to. But like I said, with the pen, there pretty much is no moving or adjusting. So before I draw, I think a lot more about what I'm going to do and try to visualize what I want to do before I put the pen to the paper. One thing I realized while working on this picture is how I choose to stylize things has changed. For things like the fur in the ears and for her clothes, I used a lot of little strokes and made the shapes not super defined in the first drawing. And this kind of includes the hair as well. It was very round and seemed kind of flat. However, for this picture, I defined the shapes more and stylized the fur to be chunkier shapes. I also broke up the hair into more chunks of varying sizes to make the hair more interesting and lively. I do kind of wish I was able to get more variety with this pen. I feel like the shading on the hair would have ended up nicer and having a better gradient to it if I could have had better control of the pen. But the look and contrast of the black with the dark paper is also kind of neat. Like I said, I often avoid black since it is pretty harsh and not always the easiest to work with. But the contrast of it against the white paper is really neat. Oh, I almost forgot, I also added the branches with the leaves. I didn't have quite as much room to fit them in, but I tried to make it work. Now let's compare the pictures. Here's the first picture, and here's the second picture. And here they are together. Even though both pages have a girl just kind of looking at us, for some reason I feel like the new one is a bit more lively feeling. But yeah, like I said, I do kind of prefer how I was able to get finer lines with my pen in the first one, but I tried to work with the only pen I could find and I feel like it turned out decently. For this last page I'm redrawing, I wanted to pick something that was a little bit more finished to challenge myself a bit more. I decided to go with this page that has this kind of jester character on it. I remember loving this drawing when I first made it, and I made it the thumbnail for that video. Also, if you do want to go back and look at this whole sketchbook, you can. But it is an older video, so keep that in mind. I am a bit nervous to redraw this picture, mostly because, like I mentioned, the sketchbook is much tinier. So to draw a torso up drawing in the sketchbook, I don't have nearly as much room to work with to get the details, and they'll have to be much tinier. So on this first page, I was trying to draw basically the exact same pose like the original picture, but I just wasn't vibing with this pose for some reason. It just felt bland and stiff, plus the head was too big. I was thinking of trying to draw the same pose again, and maybe I would like it better the second time. But just for the heck of it, I flipped to the next page to give a slightly different pose a try. For this pose, the character is turned a bit more. She is still going to have the hand on the left up in kind of a shushing position, but her torso is going to be bent over a bit and the arm on the right will still be placed behind the back. Overall, it's still a very similar pose, but it's a little less stiff and a bit more interesting and has a little bit more movement to it. And I was liking this a little bit more. Because of the smaller size, the face will be much tinier, and this was making me really nervous. Tiny faces are always kind of tricky for me to draw. It's hard to get the details in place and they can sometimes feel very off, even if features are moved just a little bit. Also, I will point out now that I do not like the head's position in relation to the body. Sadly, I didn't notice this until after I finished the picture and came back to look at it the next day. I did this picture all in one sitting, so this resulted in me not seeing some of my mistakes. A lot of times I will try to break up a drawing into different sittings, or I'll try to take a break to reset my eyes so I can see mistakes. However, I was a bit more crunched on time for this, so I wasn't able to do that for this picture. I do end up editing the scanned version digitally on my computer, just to make the proportions a bit less wonky. But you will see the unedited version in my sketchbook. Oh, also for the hat, I went with something a bit more realistic. The hat in the first one doesn't make much sense. I did like it, but decided to go with something a bit more logical this time around. Plus, I wanted it to fit on the paper. Now I'm sketching in more details of the outfit, like fleshing out the hand and glove, the neck frilly thing, and the vest, adding in all those little details. A lot of times when drawing traditionally, I will do one sketch. However, this sketch was feeling very rough and I wasn't feeling super confident with it. So I took my kneaded eraser. If you don't know what a kneaded eraser is, you can kind of mold it into different shapes and it's kind of sticky. They don't work great if you want to completely erase lines, but they work very well if you want to just lighten your work. Once my first sketch was lightened, I started cleaning up my lines more. This time I'm allowing myself to press harder on the pencil because I don't really plan to erase these lines. Also, earlier I mentioned that this paper can handle a good amount of erasing, and I learned this with this picture. For some parts like the closed eye and the legs, I erased and redid them a few different times. Thankfully the paper was able to hold up. I always get nervous about erasing parts because I don't want the paper to end up all smudgy and damaged. So I try to avoid doing that, especially when I plan to finish the piece on the same piece of paper. I'm not going to make you completely re-watch me sketch the same exact thing, so let's move on to where I start coloring. When you watch me draw digitally, I often do line art first and then start coloring. However, for traditional pictures, I often do the opposite. I color first and then do line art. I do this because then when I'm coloring, I don't have to worry about smudging my line art. It also helps me define the shapes with colors a bit more instead of just filling in things like a coloring book. It often helps me pick better values for my shading. I do want to mention I did sketch my drawing with a pink because if it does smudge or break down into the marker, it often looks okay, especially for areas like the skin. In fact, I often kind of like it when it does. It's an easy way to add a bit of shading or more pink in areas to the skin, like the cheeks. If I had sketched with a blue or green, it wouldn't have blended with this color palette as well, and I would have chosen to lighten my sketch again. But in this case, it was okay to leave my sketch dark and let it mix with the markers a bit. I do have to say the red areas were a bit tricky to work with. I do have a good variety of red markers, but it seems like with my markers for the reds, they are all kind of similar in value, but then they suddenly get very dark. I don't really have a good middle color to transition between the two, but I tried my best to make it work. I did really like working with the red. It really pops. I know I kind of keep saying that I'm at a bit of a disadvantage with working in the sketchbook because of its size. However, when it comes to working with markers, this sketchbook was a bit better. My other sketchbook is a mixed media sketchbook. The paper is thicker and has a bit more tooth to it. This kind of paper can work well with markers, especially if you plan to use color pencil and different mediums, but it can also be a bit trickier to get smooth areas of color because of how the paper absorbs the color. You really have to go over areas and soak the paper in the ink, and this ends up using a lot of ink, especially when filling in large areas. That's why the coloring in the first one is pretty streaky. Plus, I just wasn't as experienced with markers at the time. However, this paper is much easier to get a smooth layer of color on because it is very smooth. It's also much thinner, so the amount of ink it takes to saturate the paper is much less. My sister Reagan came up behind me and questioned, "Is it fun drawing the same picture at a smaller size?" And I replied with, "I wouldn't call it fun, but it's interesting for sure." It was very labor intensive and also made me nervous working at the smaller size, but it is also faster to color and kind of work on. Reagan also found it funny that I was giving the smaller one more shading. This wasn't really my intention, it just kind of ended up that way. For this picture compared to the other one, I allowed myself to stray a little from the original source and allowed myself to work a bit more like I usually do for my current sketchbook pages or illustrations. This resulted in me using more colors for the shading and changing up the pose, but I think it's okay to stray a bit, especially since I was trying to stay pretty true to the sources for the first two drawings. For this one, I kind of just wanted to take a lot of inspiration from the first picture, while also kind of letting myself do my own thing. Also, I did try my best to match up the colors the best I could, but I did slightly change some of the values of the grays to make them stand out from each other a bit more, and I did have a hard time matching up the color of the hair, but I got pretty close. For the original picture, I was using Copic markers, and for this one, I'm using Ohuhu markers. I still have my Copic markers, but a lot of them are getting old or dried out. Whereas I just recently got sent a 320 set of Ohuhu markers, so I thought I'd put them to use. And I've noticed that Ohuhu markers seem to be overall brighter or more saturated with their color choices, whereas Copic a lot of times feels just a tish more muted, if that makes sense, or a bit softer. Like, they do still have really bright and saturated colors, but Ohuhu is often somehow more saturated looking, I feel like. But yeah, I was trying my best to match up the colors. After I was happy with the coloring, I started adding the outlines so that we can better see the character and the details. To help make the outlines feel softer, I did use different colors for different areas, like a lighter brown for details on the face, a more muted brown for the hair, red around some of the parts of the clothes, and so on. I am using water-based fine liners, so they will smudge or bleed if I go over them with marker. That's why I tried to make sure I was really done with the coloring before I added the line work. I do wonder if it's a little unfair to compare this picture to the old one because I do think I spent a bit more time on it. This picture took me about 2 hours. I don't remember how long the first one took me, but now that I think about it, it was probably about the same amount of time. I've gotten faster at drawing over the years, and I used to be slower, so I actually probably spent about the same amount of time. Anyways, now that this piece is done, let's compare. Here's the old piece. Here's the new piece. And here they are side by side. Like I mentioned, I did slightly edit the proportions of the scanned version of the new picture just to make them a bit more to my liking, but it's not a huge change. This was a lot of fun to do and I really enjoyed it. It was really neat to revisit old concepts and seeing how I would draw them now. And I've done this a few times for digital art, but I don't do it as often for traditional art, so it was a lot of fun. If you'd like to see me do this again, please let me know and give this video a thumbs up. I really enjoyed working on this video, so I hope you all like it too. Before we end, I want to say a super big thank you to my wonderful YouTube members and Patreon patrons for their support. It means so much to me. And thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next week in my next video. Bye!